My name is Julian Reyes, and 3 weeks ago, I stood in a boatyard I already owned, and let my uncle tell me I'd never amount to anything. I smiled. I said nothing. I picked up a wrench, and kept working on the hull in front of me. The same hull my grandfather taught me to sand when I was 9 years old. My uncle didn't know that the papers were already signed. He didn't know that the marina, the boatyard, the little office with the cracked window unit, all of it, belonged to me, and had belonged to me for 11 days. He thought he was talking to a 28-year-old mechanic who fixed boat engines for tourists. He was talking to his new landlord. The next morning, he found out. And what he did when he found out is the reason I'm telling you this story. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to when I was 16, standing on the same dock, when my grandfather said something to me that I didn't understand until 11 days ago. My grandfather's name was Silas Reyes, and he smelled like diesel and cedar shavings, a smell that never left his hands even after he scrubbed them raw every night at the kitchen sink. He built Reyes Marina from a single rented slip in 1974, and by the time I was old enough to hold a sander, it had grown into 14 boat slips, a repair shop, and a little bait shop that never made money, but that he refused to close, because the old fisherman needed somewhere to sit. The shop smelled like salt and motor oil, and the particular sweetness of fiberglass resin, curing in the sun. On summer mornings, the whole place rang with the sound of halyards clinking against aluminum masts, a sound I still hear when I close my eyes. My grandfather's hands were rough as bark, and when he laid one on my shoulder, it felt like the only steady thing in a house that was never steady. My father left when I was 4. My mother worked 2 jobs and slept most of her third. It was my grandfather who fed me dinner most nights, who taught me to read a tide chart before I could read a chapter book, who let me sleep on the cot in the back office when things at home got loud. My grandfather kept a coffee can on the shop counter, full of stripped screws and loose washers, and every kid who ever worked a summer at that yard learned to dig through it looking for the one piece that fit. He never threw anything away that could still be useful, and he said that about people too, though I didn't understand that as a compliment until years later. On rainy days, when no boats could come out of the water, he'd sit me at the workbench with a coffee mug of hot chocolate and teach me knots, bowline, cleat hitch, clove hitch, his thick fingers moving slow enough for me to follow, the rain drumming on the tin roof the whole time. Those are some of the only quiet, unhurried hours I remember from my childhood. There is one memory I keep coming back to. I was 16, sanding the hull of an old Chris-craft with him on a July evening, the light going gold and heavy over the water, and I asked him why he never let my Uncle Wesley run the yard, even though Wesley was older, even though Wesley had a business degree from a college my grandfather had paid for. My grandfather didn't stop sanding. He said, "Wesley sees a boat and he sees a number. You see a boat and you see a story. A yard runs on the second thing, Julian. The first thing just sells it out from under you." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was talking about boats. He wasn't talking about boats. Wesley visited twice a year, at Thanksgiving and on my grandfather's birthday, always in a blazer that didn't belong anywhere near salt water, always asking about the property's appraised value, like it was a normal thing to ask a man over turkey. My grandfather would just nod and change the subject, and I'd watch something tighten behind his eyes, something he never explained to me. That was the cold house, Wesley's house, 40 minutes inland, where I visited exactly twice and never wanted to go back. The warm place was always the dock, always the smell of resin, always my grandfather's rough hand steadying mine on the sander. Even then, some small animal part of me sensed that Wesley was waiting for something. I didn't have a name for it yet. I just knew that when Wesley looked at the marina, he wasn't looking at my grandfather's whole life. He was looking at square footage. My grandfather got sick the winter I turned 26. It started as a cough he blamed on the cold snap, and by March, it was a diagnosis nobody wanted to say out loud in the same room as him. I moved into the little apartment above the bait shop so I could be there every morning, and for 8 months, I ran the yard while he got weaker in the back office, still coming in, most days to sit in his chair by the window and watch the boats come and go. Wesley visited more in those 8 months than he had in the previous 8 years, and I want you to understand exactly what that increase in visits looked like, because it tells you everything. He never once helped haul a boat. He never once picked up a tool. What he did was walk the property with his phone out, taking photos of the shoreline. What he did was ask the harbor master, in front of me, what the going rate was for waterfront acreage in our county. What he did was refer to my grandfather, while my grandfather could still hear him from the next room, as the estate, a full 4 months before there was an estate to refer to. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. I remember one afternoon in April, a few weeks before the end, when Wesley came by and found me changing my grandfather's bed sheets in the little room off the office, where he'd taken to resting between visits from the boats. Wesley stood in the doorway with his phone still in his hand and asked me, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either, whether I'd given any thought to what comes next for me, meaning the yard, meaning himself, meaning nothing at all to do with the man dying 20 feet away. I told him I hadn't thought about it. That was true. I hadn't. I was too busy thinking about tide charts and medication schedules to think about ownership. Wesley nodded like my silence confirmed something he already believed about me, and he left without saying goodbye to his own father. The night my grandfather died, I was the one who found him, sitting in his chair by the window, the tide chart for the following week still open on his desk. I called Wesley. He arrived 90 minutes later, in the blazer, and the first thing he said, standing in the doorway of the office that still smelled like my grandfather's coffee, was, "We should get a realtor out here before the market shifts." I didn't answer him. I walked past him and locked up the shop for the night, the way my grandfather had taught me, checking each line, killing each light. I didn't sleep. I sat on the dock until the sky turned gray, listening to the halyards, and I made a decision I couldn't yet act on. I decided that whatever Wesley was planning, I was not going to be the boy who watched it happen. I just didn't know yet that I wouldn't have to fight for that. Somebody had already fought for it, years before I understood there was a fight coming. I was invisible to Wesley in every conversation that followed. A mechanic, a hired hand, a detail to be managed once the paperwork cleared. I let him believe that. I had started, without fully realizing it, to understand that being underestimated was the only advantage I had. 2 weeks after the funeral, a woman named Renata Okafor called my cell phone and asked if I could come to her office downtown. I didn't recognize the name. I assumed it was a vendor, or a collections call about the yard's insurance. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building I'd walked past 100 times without ever looking up at. She had a folder on her desk with my name on the tab, and she told me she had been my grandfather's estate attorney for 11 years, and that 4 years ago, quietly, without telling me or Wesley or anyone at the yard, he had placed Reyes Marina into an irrevocable trust, with my name as sole beneficiary. I sat very still. She explained it slowly, in plain language, because she could see I wasn't processing it. The trust had been funded and locked 4 years earlier. It could not be altered, contested, or dissolved by anyone, including Wesley, including a court, including my grandfather himself once it was signed. Wesley's name appeared nowhere in the document. My grandfather had gone to Renata's office alone, on a Tuesday I now realized was the same week Wesley first mentioned appraised value at Thanksgiving, and he had made absolutely certain that no matter what happened to him, no matter what Wesley tried, the yard would land in the one set of hands he trusted to keep it a story instead of a number. Renata told me Wesley had already called her office twice that week, asking about his father's estate, and pushing for an expedited reading of the will. There was no will regarding the marina to read. There was only the trust, and the trust was mine, and Wesley didn't know it existed. I sat with that for a long moment. Renata asked if I wanted to notify him immediately. I said no. I wanted to understand every page first. That night I went back to the yard and, without meaning to, I overheard Wesley on the phone in the parking lot, his voice carrying over the water, the way sound does at night on a marina. He was talking to a developer named Pruitt about a 14-slip conversion into luxury condominiums, quoting a closing timeline of 90 days, quoting a number that made my stomach turn, not because it was small, but because he said it the exact same way my grandfather warned me he would, like a man reading off a spreadsheet, instead of a man talking about his own father's life's work. I stood in the shadow of the bait shop and listened to him promise Pruitt the deal would be cleared by end of quarter, no complications. I texted Renata 2 words, "Ready now." I went back to the apartment above the bait shop, and I lay awake, listening to Wesley's car pull out of the lot, thinking about a man who was, at that exact moment, going to sleep certain he had already won a war he didn't know had ended 4 years earlier. Have you ever had to stay silent, to protect yourself, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Renata walked me through the trust documents over the following week, sitting across a small table with a lamp between us, explaining each clause until I could have recited them myself. I would inherit the property outright, debt-free, the moment I signed a formal acceptance and recorded it with the county. Until I signed, Wesley could keep making calls to developers all he wanted. None of it would matter, because he had no legal standing to sell a single square foot. Renata told me the timing was mine to choose. I asked her what would happen if I waited. She said nothing would change except Wesley's blood pressure. She also told me something my grandfather had said to her, the day he signed the trust, that she'd written down almost word for word, because she said it stayed with her. He told her, "Julian doesn't need to be told, he's protected. He needs to find out on his own time, when he's ready to carry it." Renata said she'd waited 11 days after the funeral, specifically because she'd promised him she wouldn't rush me, that she'd let me grieve first, and own the yard second. I sat in her office a long time after she said that, looking out at the parking lot, not saying anything at all. 2 days later, Wesley called me directly for the first time in months, his voice suddenly warm in a way it had never been warm before. He invited me to lunch. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about family, and that he wanted the 2 of us to run things together, the way Dad would have wanted. He offered me a manager's salary, 12% above what I made now, if I'd support the sale and stay on as operations lead under the new ownership. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled like a man who'd already won. He picked up the check before I could reach for it, which was, I realized later, the first generous thing I'd seen him do in 11 days, and even that was a kind of down payment. On the drive back to the yard, I passed the marina sign my grandfather had painted himself 30 years earlier, the paint chipped now on the R in Reyes, and I thought about how many times Wesley must have driven past that same sign over the years, without once stopping to touch up the letters. That week, my grandfather's neighbor, an 11-year-old boy named Theo, who used to help me stack lobster traps for $1 an hour, asked me why I looked so tired all the time, and why I kept staring at the water instead of answering him when he talked. I told him I was just thinking about his grandfather, my grandfather, I misspoke, and Theo just nodded like kids do when they understand more than adults give them credit for. That night I drove out to the yard alone, after closing, and sat in my grandfather's chair by the window for the first time since he died. The tide chart was still on the desk. I picked it up and I almost drove to Wesley's house right then, almost pounded on his door, and told him exactly what I knew, exactly what he didn't. I wanted to see his face collapse in real time. But I remembered what my grandfather said about the two ways of seeing a boat, and I understood, finally, sitting in his chair, that confronting Wesley with words would only prove I was still playing his game, reacting, explaining, arguing. My grandfather never argued with Wesley. He just quietly made sure Wesley's plans would never work. I cried that night, alone in that office, not because I was weak, but because I finally understood the shape of the gift my grandfather had given me, 4 years before I knew I'd need it. I wish Wesley had been the kind of son who would have knelt beside our grandfather's chair, instead of pricing the shoreline behind his back. I wish Wesley had learned what a tide chart was for. But wishes don't keep a marina running. A trust does. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to turn. 11 days after the funeral, at 11:50 at night, I sat at the small table in Renata's home office. She'd offered to meet after hours, so I wouldn't have to explain a daytime absence to anyone at the yard, and we went through the acceptance documents one final time, by video call, while she confirmed each page on her end. My hand was steady. I signed. Renata's voice, when she confirmed the filing had gone through, was warm but businesslike, the way my grandfather's own attorney should sound. It's done, Julian. It's yours. Silas would be proud of how you waited. The clock on my laptop read 12:03 a.m. I am 28. I am the sole owner of Reyes Marina. 40 minutes inland, in a house I'd visited exactly twice. Wesley was almost certainly still awake, finalizing paperwork with a developer named Pruitt for a property he did not, and had never, owned. He would find that out in about 9 hours. The next morning was the small memorial gathering the family held at the yard itself, folding chairs set up between the slips. My grandfather's old friends from the bait shop standing in their windbreakers with coffee going cold in their hands. Wesley found me by the fuel dock and pulled me aside, blazer buttoned despite the heat, and told me the paperwork with Pruitt's group was ready for signature, that all he needed was for me to sign off as a formality, given your role there. I told him, calmly, that I wasn't going to sign anything, because there was nothing left for me to sign. The property had already transferred, 11 days ago, into an irrevocable trust in my name, and his deal with Pruitt had never had a single piece of paper backing it. Wesley's phone rang, while I was still talking. It was Renata's office, returning his calls from that week, informing him formally, on my instruction, that Reyes Marina was not part of any estate he had standing over. I watched his face do something I'd never seen it do before. Not anger exactly, more like the specific stillness of a man doing arithmetic that refuses to add up. He looked at me like I was still the mechanic he'd offered a manager's job to 3 days earlier. I wasn't. I hadn't been for 11 days. My grandfather used to say that a yard runs on story, not on numbers, and for years I thought he only meant the yard. He meant me too. He meant that the 4 years he spent quietly building a trust nobody knew about was its own kind of story, one he never explained to me, because he wanted me to grow into understanding it on my own timeline, not his. Wesley sold his stake in a smaller inland property 6 months later, and moved out of state. We haven't spoken since the fuel dock. I heard through a cousin that the Pruitt deal collapsed within a month, once the developer realized there had never been a real seller behind it, and that Wesley had already spent money on lawyers chasing a property he never owned. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that. I mostly just felt tired, the way you feel after a long day of sanding, when the work is finally done, and there's nothing left to do but look at what you made. Renata still handles the yard's legal filings, and she still calls every July to ask if the Chris Craft ever sold. As for me, I still have the marina, the cracked window unit and all, and Theo helps me stack traps most Saturdays for $2 an hour now, inflation being what it is. Some evenings, when the light goes gold and heavy over the water the way it did when I was 16, I sand a hull alone and think about a rough hand on my shoulder, steady even when nothing else was. And I think, some people spend their whole lives trying to win an argument. My grandfather spent his, making sure I'd never have to have one. If you've ever had to stay quiet and let someone underestimate you while you already held everything that mattered, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments below. And if this story moved you, subscribe. There are more to come.